This program is brought to you by Pussy Magnets.
Put a midge on your friend with a pussy magnet.
Welcome, welcome, my lovely lumps. Or maybe let's go with lovely labs. That's pretty on brand. Anyway, I'm so thrilled to have you here in the Labia Lounge. We're going to be yarning about all things sexuality, intimacy, womanhood, relating, holistic health, and everything in between. We're going to have vag loads of real chats with real people about real shit. So buckle up because you're about to receive the sex ed that you never had and hopefully have a bit of a chuckle while you're at it. Before we get stuck in, I'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which I'm recording this, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. It's a massive privilege to be living and creating dope podcast content in Naarm, and I just want to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. Now, if you're ready, let's flap and do this.
Don't panic, you're not broken. Your sex education was a piece of shit. Get your flaps out and pull up the couch. It's the Labia Lounge.
Hey gang, just before we jump into this episode, I wanted to offer you an opportunity to access my new mini course for free before I start charging for it in future. It's for people with vulvas and it's quick to complete. It's all about demystifying the female body and pleasure anatomy and getting some basic fundamentals to understand your body better. It's called Pussy Pleasure Secrets, Your Roadmap to Bedroom Bliss. You can grab it on the freebies page of my website or in the show notes. It's a great little free resource to kind of dip your toe in or act as a bit of a taster for my work. So if you've ever been curious about this sort of thing and you just don't know where to start, or you want a really quick, easy, accessible, non-threatening way to get the ball rolling and start working on this stuff, this is a great place to start. Hey, my labial lovers, come on into the lounge, pull up a click cushion. We've got some ripper chats planned for you today about limerence. If you don't know what this is, it's got to be one of the most relatable and misunderstood experiences, in my opinion. And you may have heard it called like the honeymoon period, being in a love bubble, having the love goggles on, or you might have experienced it just as like a super intense crush that took away all of your common sense, self-respect and boundaries in the courtship period. We often mistake this sort of intensity of limerence for new love, and we associate the dramatic chemistry and the spark of it all as like the only type of connection worth seeking, because this is what we sort of see modeled in media and things. But I've got a guest today who's got a bit more intel for us that will help us develop a more nuanced and healthy approach to riding out the intensity and navigating limerence. And we're going to learn exactly what limerence is and, how to recognize limerence versus love versus, all of these sort of things, especially in that like early courtship period. So I've got Orly Miller. Orly's a psychologist and she's also the author of the upcoming book, Limerence, The Psychopathology of Loving Too Much. She writes and speaks about obsession, intimacy, and the shadow sides of love. And I'm super excited to get stuck in with you, Orly, because this is a topic that I have thought about and learned about and been in amongst myself so much of my life. And I love to like pick apart and unpack what is actually going on in my brain chemistry when I'm feeling completely taken away with, the early stages of crushing out on someone and this new relationship energy. So welcome, Orly. I'm really excited to chat with you.
Thank you, Freya. Thanks for having me.
So I guess, I tried to do a bit of a job of explaining what limerence is, but you're the expert. Can you give us a bit of a rundown on what is limerence and how does it differ from healthy love?
Sure. So generally speaking, there is a common misconception that limerence is the same thing or akin to the early stages of love, or new relationship energy, as you put it, or a really intense crush. Now, some mental health professionals will agree with you and they will propose the exact same thing, that limerence is part of early courtship. What I actually argue in my forthcoming book is that limerence is a distinct state. So my perspective on limerence is that it is actually not part of the courtship process. It is not just simply part of the healthy early stages of love, but actually it is a distinct pathological, psychological state that is actually separate to any stages of normative love formation.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, what I'm hearing is like it's not an essential or unavoidable feature of early stage love or crushing, but it's a state that is possible in that period. Because from my understanding, like it generally will only happen in the early stages. It doesn't always happen, especially if there's like secure attachment and the love is developing in a healthy way at a healthy pace. But like that limerence generally only features in that early stage. Is that correct?
So that is not my perspective. So the way that I view limerence is actually it can happen in all kinds of different relationship dynamics. It doesn't actually even have to be manifested within a relationship with someone the person even knows. So in extreme cases, limerence can actually manifest for someone that a person has never met. It can be a celebrity, a social media influencer. It can be someone that a person interacts with in daily life but has no very deep or personal connection with. For example, in my book, I have case studies throughout, and just one example is a man who goes to buy paint from a woman at an art shop and becomes limerent for her, even though the only interaction they've actually had in person is that one interaction where he bought paint from her. So again, there's this common misconception that limerence can only manifest within a relationship dynamic where there is a possibility, a tangible possibility for two people to develop a relationship, but that's actually not the case. So limerence can manifest in many different kinds of relationship dynamics, even with someone that the person doesn't know, the person doesn't really speak to, and there really doesn't seem to be much real life chance of them developing a relationship. Another example in which limerence is manifest frequently is in a situation where the person is known to the individual, but there's an external obstacle that prevents them from developing the relationship. So that could be, for example, two people who are married or already in committed relationships. There can be one-sided limerence where one person is limerent for the other, but there can also be mutual limerence where the two are limerent for each other, but there's this obstacle of their pre-existing commitments. Another example of that could be someone who finds themselves infatuated, obsessed with somebody, but they can't be together because of familial disagreement or cultural reasons. So that's kind of akin to that sort of Romeo and Juliet situation where there's an external barrier. But
that was exactly the example I was thinking of. I was like, oh, this is classic Romeo and Juliet. And, and also parasocial relationships nowadays and, stalker dynamics and things like that. Like definitely
there was just an article that came out last weekend in The Guardian by Nicole Madigan, who's written a book on stalking. She's a journalist and she's written two books. One of her books is called Obsessed, and it's about her own experience of stalking. And she reached out to me to collaborate on this article for The Guardian. And the question she was asking me was, will limerence lead to stalking? Okay, so again, this is another misconception, but I argue that no, it won't. It's not the same thing. And the reason for that is because with limerence, the sort of what limerence really is, it's more than a crush, and it's more than just being into someone that you're falling for. Limerence involves obsessive and intrusive thoughts. So meaning you're not in control of your mind anymore. You're trying to stop thinking about this person, but you can't. It involves compulsive behaviours aimed at soothing the obsession. So things like constantly checking their social media or replaying interactions in your mind compulsively. It involves fantasy. It involves emotional volatility. Your emotional and psychological state hinges on perceived levels of reciprocation. But ultimately, the biggest part of limerence, aside from the longing, is this really overwhelming, powerful desire for emotional reciprocation. You really, really, really want the other person to want you too. Now, with limerence, what sustains limerence and what creates limerence, there's a very specific formula. You have to have both of these components in order for limerence to exist. There has to be hope and there has to be doubt. Okay? So, yeah, you have some kind of hope that the other person will want you to, but you also have doubt. You're not sure, right? There's another disorder that's actually in the DSM already, which is called erotomania. It's a ridiculous name because of what it sort of brings to mind. But what erotomania is it's a delusional belief that another person is in love with you. You're certain, you're sure they love you too. And that is what leads to stalking. You're absolutely sure that this person is your soulmate. They believe it too. They're your twin flame. They're meant for you. They love you. That's what leads to stalking. Limerence is different. Limerence is, I want them to want me, but I'm not sure. And I'm really careful not to do or say anything that's going to make me lose favor in their eyes. And that's why stalking will not really come into the equation when it comes to limerence, because there's a lot more caution and there's not a delusional belief that the other person wants you to be there next to them all the time. One more thing I'll say on that is there's a difference between actual stalking and compulsively checking someone's social media. Okay. There's digital stalking, but without interaction. That compulsive checking, it actually comes from a place of anxiety. The limerent individual has so much dysregulated attachment and anxiety that causes them to compulsively check to see the face of or see the updates of the other person. It's purely to soothe their anxiety. Whereas stalking, that comes from a place of control. I own you, and malice. You're mine. And I'm going to show you that you're mine. So the two things are really distinct. And in my opinion, and also in the opinions of some other researchers, limerence is not likely to lead to stalking purely because of that really strong desire for reciprocation and the doubt.
Yeah, interesting distinction. I mean, I wasn't thinking or saying that limerence leads to stalking. I was just thinking that in a stalking dynamic, perhaps limerence would be present because that fixation and that obsession. But I suppose it's a little bit more pathological, the sort of stalking compulsion compared to maybe like a digital stalking and parasocial relationships and fantasies that develop. And yeah, I just assumed in the pipeline that it might start as like a more harmless sort of form of limerence and sort of could develop. But anyway, we're not talking about stalking. That's not really the topic of the podcast. What I want to learn about is how limerence kind of can show up in just like regular kind of dynamics and what kind of keeps it going. Because what I was sort of trying to say before when I was like, oh, early stages versus long-term relationship is like, my understanding is like, when you're in a long-term relationship with someone, maybe there isn't room for limerence because you are now like very much, you know the person really well, you're in a relationship, it's like a totally different dynamic. So I assumed that limerence was something that only happened when either you don't know the person very well or it's very like early days. Would that be correct? Or like do people get limerence even in long-term relationships?
No. So that's correct. Exactly. So basically there's a difference, in my opinion, between limerence, which I set out as a unique state, and normative, healthy love. So to understand the difference, perhaps it would be helpful to sort of just briefly go through the stages of normative love develop. So obviously there's going to be cultural and individual differences, but generally speaking, normative love seems to follow specific stages. So the first stage is attraction, infatuation, you want to be close to the person, and each of the stages is governed by different neurochemistry, okay? So then in normative love, if the other person feels the same, it's reciprocal and there's no barriers, then you get together. And then the next stage is this kind of attachment formation where you perhaps become more settled. It's governed more by oxytocin rather than sort of that dopamine, serotonin. So you become more settled, you become exclusive with each other if that's your relationship choice. You know, there's all different configurations these days, but generally speaking, you know, you sort of, you do what's called pair bonding. You bond as a pair. And then if all goes well, you get to the next stage, which is you're bonded, right? And so you have a hopefully secure attachment. You're together. Every relationship has problems, but you're secure in your relationship. So that is the general trajectory of the development of normative healthy love. Limerence, on the other hand, follows a very different path. So what happens with limerence is it'll begin with some kind of attraction, some kind of soul recognition or flitter or glimmer, you know, where you just have this kind of curiosity about this person, this pull, this magnetism towards a particular person. Now, as I said before, this could be someone that you have had a date with or a couple of dates, or this could be someone you've seen on the train commute or someone you eye from across the office or someone's cousin you saw at a wedding, right? You don't have to have started a relationship with this person. And then what happens is, irrespective of what is actually progressing or not progressing within the real life relationship, the limerent individual starts to become more and more obsessed with this person. So there's this initial curiosity, which then develops into infatuation. The limerent person sets aside time to fantasize about this other person, sometimes hours and hours in a day. And initially, these fantasies are very pleasurable. They bring all kinds of different neurochemistry that is pleasurable, including stress relief. And then what happens is these fantasies start to become addictive. The thoughts about the other person begin to become intrusive so that it starts to disrupt their ability to function in daily life. So it's not really about the relationship between the person and the other person like it is with the normative healthy love trajectory. It's actually more of an intrapsychic experience that's happening for the limerent individual themselves, irrespective of what's going on, if anything is going on with the other person. So just as a quick example, you know, someone could meet someone, have one interaction with them, and then spend 3 months fantasizing about them, thinking about them. It can be their first thought upon waking. They can go to therapy trying to stop thinking about this person because it's distracting and they can't stop thinking about it. So in this way, it's more akin to something like obsessive compulsive disorder, right? Which, you know, obsessive compulsive disorder is between a person and themselves. That's similar to limerence, right? And so, you know, you asked about, you know, how can limerence develop in everyday situations? I think the first misconception to clear up that's really important is it doesn't have to be in a relationship that's actually forming. It can really actually be with anyone. It can be with a teacher, a professor, anyone. There's so many different examples. And the other thing that I think is worth mentioning is if you look at, so limerence isn't currently recognised as a mental health disorder in the DSM, which is the book that we as mental health professionals use to diagnose psychological disorders. The threshold of what makes something a disorder is, does it greatly impair a person's ability to function in important areas of life, in self-care, in work, in relationships, right? So if a person is having obsessive, intrusive thoughts, longing, constant distraction, constant mood swings, emotional volatility, that is greatly impairing a person's ability to function. And all of the mental health disorders that are in the DSM are actually basic, normative human emotions taken too far, right? So sadness is a normal human emotion. It's healthy to feel sadness, but taken to an extreme and coupled with other symptoms, it becomes major depressive disorder. Anxiety, is a basic human emotion with an evolutionary function, but taken to an extreme, it becomes generalized anxiety disorder, etc., etc. So yes, love, infatuation, longing are absolutely healthy human emotions that have evolutionary functions, but taken to an extreme where it starts to impair the functioning and well-being of the individual, that's when it becomes, in my opinion, limerence. That's when it becomes pathological.
Wow, because I've read a lot about limerence, and I thought I kind of had a grasp on, and maybe this is other people's opinions versus your opinion, and it's such a new field, it hasn't really been researched that much, it's not in the DSM, but my understanding was way less intense. I didn't realize how pathological, I sort of assumed it was way more common and probably just that infatuation period, and maybe coupled with some attachment wounds that meant, we'd be really obsessing and really overthinking things in the early stages, but not at the level that you're describing, which is properly a mental health disorder. That's actually so much more intense. And I take back what I said about how I've totally experienced limerence before, because if this is what limerence is, then no, I haven't probably experienced it to that degree. But what I find is super common is really, really overthinking, getting really obsessed, really fixated, really infatuated when we're crushing on someone, and that being quite disempowering and probably quite distracting and a bit of an unhealthy preoccupation. That sort of seems almost a rung down from what you're describing. And so with what you're describing, who's most vulnerable to experiencing this? Are they the people that have attachment wounds or other mental health disorders? Are they the people who are more prone to getting obsessed and fixated in the early stages, and then it can just ramp up to this level? Or what are we talking here? Hey, baby babes. Sorry to interrupt. I just had to pop my head into the lounge here and mention another virtual lounge that I'd love you to get around. It's the Labia Lounge Facebook group that I've created for listeners of the poddy to mingle in. There you'll find extra bits and bobs like freebies, behind the scenes, or discounts for offerings from guests who have been interviewed on the podcast. There'll also be, hopefully, inspiring, thought-provoking conversations and support from a community of labial legends like yourself. My vision for this is that it becomes a really supportive, educational, and hilarious resource for you to have more access to me and a safe space to ask questions you can't ask anywhere else. So head over to the links in the show notes or look up the Labia Lounge group in Facebook, and I'll see you in there. And now, back to the episode.
Well, you're absolutely right. It's a very emerging field. There isn't much research. There needs to be a lot more research. So Dorothy Tenov is a psychologist from the 1970s. She's the one who coined the term limerence, and it came from a subset of participants in her research that she found were experiencing limerence. We're experiencing love, infatuation, obsession to this degree. Now, what she said in the 1970s in her book, which a lot of psychologists love to quote, who like to compare limerence to the early stages of love, is in her book, she wrote that limerence is, I'm paraphrasing, but similar to what we see in the early stages of love relationships. But what the other psychologists tend to miss out is the second half of the quote, which she says, but this is, we need to research this a lot more. And this research, she's talking about her own research, and this is a direct quote, only scratches the surface. And that actually we need to research a lot more in order to understand the potential pathological and clinical implications of this. And for some reason, nobody did it. Well, not nobody. There's a handful of researchers. Albert Wakin, who I was in contact with last year and unfortunately is very ill. There's another, a woman researcher called Wyant, and she actually did research on herself. So that's not very reliable, but, I'm still drawn on it from my book. But there's really not much research. And I think that is exactly why, Freya, you and everybody else think that limerence is a particular thing, when in reality we don't actually know. We don't know what is the depth and what are the edges of this. And that's something that I'm really trying to bring awareness to with my work, is actually there's a spectrum. So in the same way that you've said, oh, well, like I've had this crush and it's been destructive and distracting, but I haven't had it to that degree. I think that that's similar to, myself, for example. Sometimes I get anxious and I just feel really anxious. But do I meet criteria for generalized anxiety disorder? No. Or, sometimes I'm really sad, but have I been sad every day, most of the day for at least 2 weeks? No. So these, and that is the requirements for major depressive disorder. So these normal, healthy, perhaps disruptive, but natural parts of human emotion actually exist on a spectrum. And the question is, at what point does it become pathological? That's the question I'm asking. I actually propose the point in my book, which people can go and look at. But the answer is we absolutely need more research. I myself, since engaging publicly in this work, have been contacted by people all over the world seeking support for limerence, the limerence to the pathological degree that I'm describing. So it absolutely is something that I'm seeing again and again in my clinical practice. And it's coupled with this isolation, this sense of isolation, precisely because there's so many misconceptions about what limerence is and the degree to which it can become pathological. Other therapists, psychologists who don't know about limerence, haven't been trained in limerence because it's a nascent field, will often dismiss the suffering of these individuals or misdiagnose it as anxiety, as attachment issues, as OCD, when in reality it's actually its own unique constellation of symptoms that make up this pathological syndrome, in my clinical opinion. In answer to your other question, who is more vulnerable? Again, we need more research in order to answer that question clearly and reliably. But from what we can see based on, some studies and other studies and understandings, people that have early attachment wounding, people that have anxious or avoidant attachment styles to begin with, people that are prone to obsessive tendencies in general, certain aspects of neurochemistry, for example, serotonin depletion, overactivity in the amygdala, all of these can be indications of vulnerability. But in order to answer that unequivocally, we need more research. And it's actually very surprising that there isn't research in this field. I believe it's coming. I think there's going to be a cascade very soon. And it's my hope that my work and the work of others that are emerging in this field clear up these misconceptions and actually give voice to this particular expression of limerence, so that the people all over the world who are suffering start to feel less alone and less in the dark about their experiences.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's unfortunately, such a common thing that happens where, especially in mental health realms, so many things aren't understood with the nuance that is required, and therefore they get misdiagnosed, misunderstood, mislabeled. And something that there's so much overlap as well with like all the different, types of mental health disorders. There's so much overlap, so it's very difficult to pin down and peg something that's going on when it's got really similar symptoms to a whole host of other things. And then when there's intersecting mental health challenges as well, it's like, oh my God. So I feel like with this stuff, it's really common that people can go lifetimes without getting a proper diagnosis or understanding of what's truly going on, because we actually just don't understand these things with the nuance and complexity that is required. And so, yeah, I can understand why these poor people would feel so unseen and so confused and so unsupported when they're experiencing something with such intensity, and there just isn't really, a whole lot of understanding about what they're going through and how to help them. And I'm curious, like, are people who are experiencing this quite self-aware of the fact that it's a really problematic level of obsession, or are they kind of like, this is just normal, and like, how, because, yeah, I probably haven't spoken to many, if any, people that have talked about this level of intensity when it comes to limerence.
Well, psychology is not an exact science, right? It's not like medicine. We can't take a blood test and see, what's going on. It's a lot more subjective than that. And with technology and neuroimaging and PET scans, things are becoming more exact, but it's always evolving. And I'll give you an example. Homosexuality was considered a mental disorder up until 1972, right? So that was actually in the DSM. Imagine today. It's wild to think of it. Another example, generalized anxiety disorder was not included in the DSM until the 3rd edition. Similarly, borderline personality disorder, which is a well-established disorder today, was dismissed as insignificant, as a personality issue, or misdiagnosed and put into categories of other diagnoses until psychologist Marsha Linehan brought it to our awareness. And due to her work, it became included in the DSM. And these days, it's like, oh, yeah, generalized anxiety disorder, borderline personality disorder. Of course, homosexuality is not a mental health disorder. We're born into particular cohorts and generations, and we think it's been this way forever, but it absolutely hasn't. The DSM is a living document that's constantly undergoing change and review based on emerging research and new understandings of human behavior and personality and emotion. And so at the moment, because limerence is not understood or included as a specific set of symptoms, it's not the fault of psychologists who misdiagnose. They have no awareness of it. Totally. They're only able to choose categories that are already currently in the book. Oh, there's obsessive. Maybe it's OCD. Oh, there's fantasy. Maybe it's a delusional disorder, right? They're trying their best, but it's just simply not there yet. And I say yet because, obviously I'm not in charge of what goes in the DSM and what doesn't. It's ultimately up to researchers and to the, the societies in the head of the APS that put it together. But it's my belief that with more research, they will be more understanding of the pathological expression of limerence, and it's possible that it will be included in a future edition of the DSM. I do believe that, because again and again, from my own clinical research and what I'm seeing in clinical presentations, is it really does manifest as a very specific set of symptoms. The same symptoms are present in each case, and it's a unique constellation of symptoms that doesn't fit into any other category. In terms of your question, do people who are experiencing this know that this is pathological, or do they think it's normal? Well, the way that I can answer that is through an understanding of Google searches. And there are millions of people searching, is this normal? Is this a mental health disorder? What is going on to me? What is happening to me? What's going on in my mind? Why can't I get out of this? And more and more, they're now going to be finding proper literature around limerence that's going to help them. But up until, not long ago, because it's really just starting to kind of pop off in the actual psychological literature and world. Prior to that, they were really just left with like Reddit threads and, pop psychology posts, which are full of just misconceptions. But to answer your question, yes, they know it's pathological because they are suffering severely. Imagine losing control of your mind. Like your whole life, you just go along and yourself is the focus of your psyche, which is good, which is healthy, which is normal. What kind of person do I want to be? What kind of work do I want to do? How do I want to look after my body and my mind and my spirit and my community? You are at the center. And then all of a sudden, there's this external person at the center of your mind, and you can't get them out. And you're trying everything to stop thinking about them and stop fantasizing about them and move on, but you can't, because it's an obsessive loop. And it starts to really take hold of your psyche to the detriment of yourself, your self-care, your self-development, your own work, your own relationships. So do these people know it's pathological? Yes, they're suffering and they're looking for help. And we know this based on Google Analytics.
Yeah, wow. It's such an interesting but pretty effective way to actually get the read on like the general like mood around this stuff, isn't it? Google searches, that's genius. I just had a curiosity pop up. Like, say there's someone who's experiencing limerence for someone that they have met, maybe they've gone on a couple of dates or whatever. If it were to turn into a relationship and they pair bond and there is a bit more sort of stability within that connection and it's developing, they're getting to know the person more and more, which sort of does away with a lot of the initial projections and assumptions and fantasies about someone. The more you get to know them, the less room there is for all of those kind of, constructions that you've come up with yourself. Can limerence sort of naturally disappear if they do wind up in a relationship with that person, whether it be a longer term friendship or a romantic relationship, or does it generally sabotage any chance of that relationship because the obsessiveness doesn't go away? Or
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's a very highly searched question. Speaking of Google Analytics, can limerence turn into love? And the answer is, in my opinion, limerence can't turn into love because, as I said before, the way I conceptualize limerence is separate from the entire normative love trajectory. But as I said before, in order for limerence to thrive, in order for it to be sustained and to exist, there has to always be the equation of hope and doubt. So how do you kill limerence? How does limerence die? It dies either with the dissolution of hope. The person says to you unequivocally, I will never be with you. I do not love you. I do not like you in that way. which gives forth, a flood of grief and heartbreak and a whole range of other emotions, but essentially it kills the hope. So the limerence dies. Or the other way in which limerence can die is through the death of doubt. So if the person comes to you and says, "Oh, you're obsessed with me. That's great. I think you're awesome. Let's be together," then that's the death of doubt. You know that person loves you. You know that person's interested. Your feelings are being returned. And so that also will result in the dissolution of that particular limerent episode. Will it be something that hinders the progress of a relationship? Look, every relationship in the normal, healthy relationship formation trajectory has its issues, has its kind of complications. I think that the person will have to certainly fall from the pedestal and the illusion will shatter, and you'll have to start to really see that person for who they actually are as a human being rather than the fantasy delusional projection you've been putting onto them. And that's healthy, that's good, because then you start to be able to actually relate to that person in a healthy way. And yeah, it's possible that you can then form a relationship. But I mean, the other thing that can happen is you can the illusion shatters and then you sort of go, "Oh, you're actually not what I thought you were," and you may not even be interested anymore. But it does end limerence. The third way that limerence can not end but shift is it can be transferred from one person to another. But generally speaking, it does seem to kind of end with the death of hope or doubt, and that's a particular limerent episode. So that's not to say that individual will never become limerent again for that same person or for somebody else, but that particular limerent episode will generally fade with that experience.
Yeah, interesting. Okay. And, I imagine something like a breakup or a wobble could mean that it flares up again because that sort of like doubt comes back in, that scarcity mindset, and, maybe some intersecting anxious attachment or, this classic thing of like wanting what we can't have.
100%. And also the opposite of that too, which, someone can say to you unequivocally, "This isn't going to happen. This is never going to be. We're not going to be together." So your limit, you can, go through the grief, go through the heartbreak, let go of the person, let go of the fantasy, let go of the projection, do all this work. And then 3 months later, they can pop up and like your Instagram story. Oh, there goes that we will reignite now a flame of hope. Yeah. And that can trigger a new limerent episode that can last months. So another issue to consider, which I think is really important, is social media is actually a breeding ground for limerence, because you have this real intermittent, ambiguous opportunity for connection and perceived intimacy without much effort and without even needing to see the person in real life. It's very dangerous. It's very dangerous for people who are limerent. And I have a whole chapter on that in my book, actually. But it certainly adds new elements to the equation. So I think it's really important that people understand what their triggers are. And if they have been limerent for a person in the past, and even if it's not to the level of being pathological, I can be anxious, not have generalized anxiety disorder, but still be very anxious, and that be really unpleasant for me. So just because it hasn't crossed over into the threshold of pathology doesn't mean it's not distressing and unpleasant for me. So for me, if I don't want to be anxious, I've got to do yoga. I've got to drink water. I've got to talk. I've got to go to, my woman's circle or whatever it is that keeps me grounded, even if I'm not at the level of pathological anxiety. So for someone who is limerent for someone, even if it's not at the extreme level of pathology that I was describing earlier, it's still unsettling. It's still disempowering. It's still disturbing. And so understand what your triggers are and understand what your anchors are and what your grounding is, and be responsible for your self-care within that space as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, you know, like with all of this sort of stuff, you can be more susceptible to something, and it just depends on whether there's triggers or like a perfect storm of things that crop up that then sort of exacerbate it, and then it flips over into like a pathological level of it. I'm wondering, like, I know we kind of talked about this, but I just want to get clearer on it. And for people listening, like, to, you know, I'm sure people are reflecting like, oh, I've gone on a couple of dates with this person and I've been compulsively checking my messages, or I've been getting really anxious about them replying, whether they're keen or not, blah, blah, blah. I'm making up these stories in my head about why they flaked out on our plans, and I'm getting way ahead of myself and thinking about every possible future trajectory that, you know, like, these are things that I hear commonly. And from what you sort of said initially, I'm like, oh, okay, maybe that isn't limerence, but it could be a precursor, or it could mean that they're more susceptible. How do we know when we're on the spectrum of mild limerence or in that early stage of infatuation? Because I feel like there's some really big similarities, at least on that sort of lower level end. Like, how do you know if it's problematic and potentially you will be susceptible to that turning into more of an intense experience of limerence versus a pretty normal, natural, or maybe not natural, but like a common experience of maybe just some like anxious attachment flare up in the beginning or something like that? Excuse this quick interruption. I'm shamelessly seeking reviews and 5-star ratings for the potty because, as I'm sure you've noticed by now, it's pretty fab, and the more people who get to hear it, the more people I can help with it. Reviews and ratings actually do make a big difference to this little independent podcaster. And it's really easy to just quickly show your support by taking that simple act of either leaving 5 stars for the show on Spotify, or even better, writing a written review and leaving 5 stars over on Apple Podcasts. Or if you're a real overachiever, you can do them both. That would be mad. If you're writing a review, though, just be sure to use G-rated words, because despite the fact that this is a podcast about sexuality, words like sex can be censored and your review won't make it through the gates. Lame. Anyway, I would personally recommend doing that right now while you remember, just to get on top of it and let me know you're with me on this journey. Thanks, gang. Enjoy the rest of the epi.
It's a fantastic question, Freya. It's a really good question. And it's something that, you know, we really need to spend more time studying and researching within ourselves and also within the wider population to understand. What you're asking is basically, you know, when does it tip over into pathology, and how do we know? So generally speaking, according to psychology and psychiatry, as I said previously, in order for something to be considered pathological, it has to greatly impair a person's ability to function in important areas of life. So is this affecting your ability to function at work? Is this affecting your ability to look after yourself, to eat, to sleep, to exercise? Is this affecting your other relationships? Are you so preoccupied with this situation and this dynamic that you are snappy and irritable and moody and not speaking nicely to your friends or your family, you know? And the other thing that, you know, is how long is it going on for? So when it comes to disorders in the DSM that you know, are not chronic, you know, that are episodic. So, like, for example, depression. You don't have to be depressed every day of your life forever in order to have major depressive disorder. You have to be depressed every day for most of the day for at least 2 weeks for it to be considered a depressive episode. And if you've had a depressive episode, then you have major depressive disorder and the episode can come back. And that's how I view limerence. It's episodic. You can have limerent episodes. So I propose diagnostic criteria in my book. They haven't been accepted by the psychological world, but I propose them. My proposition is there. And what I propose is a set of symptoms that you experience most days for at least 3 months, and it impairs your ability to function. So are we approaching that? You know, am I able to kind of still manage my life, or is this really starting to take over and to stress me? I think that's how we'll know if it's becoming pathological, because pathology is based on dis-ease, right? It's being unwell, it's being unstable and unbalanced in your mind, in your life, and of course in your body. There's a psychosomatic connection. It's all connected. So how will someone know is are you starting to feel really wobbly in yourself? Are you starting to feel really unstable? Because as I said before, you know, every human emotion has a very important evolutionary function. Fear and anxiety function to keep us safe individually and as a species. If we didn't have any fear or anxiety, we wouldn't exist as a species. It's kept us safe for millennia. And similarly, you know, a bit of anxious attachment at the beginning, a bit of longing, a bit of I want you so much, a bit of infatuation. This helps with staying focused on the task of mating, you know, not to make it so unromantic, but from an evolutionary standpoint,
Totally.
that's what it is. So there's a little bit of healthy, but is it too much fear that it's not adaptive anymore? Is it too much anxiety that it's not adaptive? Is it too much longing and preoccupation that it's not adaptive anymore? So the question is not, is limerence, is longing and desire unhealthy? No, of course not. It's when it becomes dysfunctional.
Yeah.
And that's the title of my book, The Psychopathology of Loving Too Much. The question I pose is, when does it tip over into pathology? And it's a question that hasn't been answered. It's a very new question in the literature and in the field. And I have a very distinct opinion on this that many others haven't put forth. Some agree with me, some of the researchers that are already there, but it's quite emerging.
And so what do you want other therapists to understand about limerence and how to support clients experiencing it? Because I know you mentioned that a lot of, and as with so many things, like you were mentioning in the past, borderline personality disorder not being understood and being misdiagnosed. And this is such a common trope that happens until we have more research and understanding about these types of things. Therapists only know what they know and only have access to what research there is. And so, yeah, it can be really misunderstood and perhaps not treated in the most optimal way through no fault of the actual therapists or the clients. But how, like, what do you want them to kind of understand? How do we actually support people experiencing this? Obviously, social media is an absolute cesspit that just exacerbates and inflames this intensely. Like, I can see that on all fronts. But yeah, like, what do you want people to know and understand?
Well, I would love therapists to read my book. I would love therapists to understand that limerence manifests as a specific constellation of symptoms that you can look for in a clinical setting that I outline very clearly in my book. And if a person meets criteria for all of these symptoms, if they're experiencing all of the parts of limerence that I lay out in my book, you know, just know what it is. Know what it is. I've got a whole section on treatment and therapy as well. But the other thing that I really want to say, which I haven't said in this conversation, but I think it's really important and I don't want to miss the opportunity to say it, is that limerence, even in its pathological expression, can also be such a beautiful, deep, poetic, mystical experience that actually has the potential to be a gateway into such profound transformation spiritually, psychically, for the person. So I guess for a therapist is to also know how to guide the person through that transformation, know how to use the Limerent episode as a gateway into transformation, because it really holds some very profound seeds for some very deep and expansive personal growth. And often the answer lies in the limerent projection itself. So the other thing I really want therapists to know is that my view is when a person is limerent for someone, it starts off as a projection. They're projecting all of these idealized traits and characteristics onto the person, onto the other. But when we trace it as therapists, what we find is it's actually a mirror. And that person that they've projected all of these characteristics and idealized traits onto, it's actually a mirror that's reflecting back to them the deep, repressed, hidden parts of themselves that they long to reunite with. And it's a really beautiful opportunity to bring that to the surface, to bring that into consciousness, and to help them to integrate those parts into their life for transformation and healing.
Oh my God, babe. I love the way you talk. That was so perfectly articulated. Damn.
Yeah.
And like such an important point. Like it is such an opportunity, and a lot of, I think that's a really sadly a missing piece with the kind of like dialogue that occurs around a lot of mental disorders and illnesses, is like there can be a real gift in these sort of states of consciousness and experiences. And I love that you brought that in, because it also works really well with IFS and parts work. It's like there's and shadow work, like we don't want to just reject and shut the door on these parts because they're uncomfortable or they're pathological or, they're problematic. We want to understand them and welcome them in, whilst also not allowing them to like derail our whole fucking life and our mental health. But I like that there's, a level of like acceptance and gentleness and self-compassion that can help us integrate and accept and take the silver linings and the lessons. And that's really beautiful to keep in mind, so that we're not then like we're already experiencing this pathology for a reason and we're suffering. We don't want to then double down on the suffering by beating ourselves up and making us feel like there's something really wrong with us that we've got to extricate from our psyche. Like, working with it and softening feels like a much more kind of effective and also like compassionate approach. And with that, like I'd love to end on something for people, like not the therapists, but the actual people that might be experiencing this. Firstly, having a name for it, having a language, having some more understanding will help normalize and validate their experience, and hopefully help them feel a little bit more acceptance and compassion for themselves. Can you outline, the criteria that you've identified, so people can kind of like cross-reference their own experience to whether or not those things apply to them, the criteria, and maybe just wrap up by kind of giving us a little bit of an idea about where to start working on this? Like, what are some action steps or some strategies for people to ease the suffering and to help hopefully help get out of this sort of vicious cycle of limerence?
Sure. Okay. So the symptoms of limerence very kind of specifically and clearly are longing for a specific other person, for someone particular, longing, obsessive thoughts that become intrusive, that you can't control, you can't stop them, fantasy and daydreaming, which, yes, is pleasurable and fun, but not when it becomes compulsive and not to the detriment of your real life. So fantasy and daydreaming, and a really strong desire for emotional reciprocation. And what that comes with is a continuous seeking, both in real life interactions and in fantasy imagined interactions, for signs, either real or imagined, and some of them are very wild and out there, signs of either reciprocation or rejection. So there's this constant analysis of absolutely everything. How did the person look at me? How did the person breathe before they said a word? How long? Sometimes it can even be not related to you in any way. When's the last time they were online on WhatsApp? Has nothing to do with you, right? So this constant seeking for signs that you interpret as signs of reciprocation or rejection. So those specific symptoms together, so longing, obsessive thoughts, daydreaming and fantasy, and desire for reciprocation and constantly seeking for signs of it, and coupled with also emotional volatility. So when you feel like there's a sign, real or imagined, that they are reciprocating, there's like this joy and elation. And when you feel like there's a sign of rejection, whatever, however minimal or obscure it may be, there's this crash in the mood. That's limerence. That's what it is. And, whether it's at the level of pathology yet or not, either way, it's unpleasant. And either way, it has an opportunity inbuilt in it for healing and transformation for yourself. And so what I would suggest to individuals who notice that you're experiencing this, well, firstly, if it is at a pathological level, if it's already gotten to the point that it's beyond your control, seek help. You can't do it alone. You need to find a therapist who understands limerence, and there's not many, but Google it. And for those who, don't want to work with someone but just want to do it themselves, what I would say to you is think about, sort of just pause yourself for a moment from being so in the projection and in the story, and just think about, what exactly is it about this other person that I'm so drawn to, that I'm so magnetized towards? What are the qualities? And write them down. And they, for example, it could be, they're just so intellectual, or they're so holy, or they're so spiritually elevated, or it's just something about them that reminds me of my childhood, or they feel comforting, or they feel familiar. Write it all down, no matter how obscure. And then look at your list, and then start to view it in a different way. Start to view it as, where can I notice these parts of myself that perhaps I've lost along the way that I really yearn to reconnect with? And how can I begin to lead them back into my life in a real, lived, tangible way? That's what I would start with.
Awesome. That's so beautiful and so practical, and honestly so applicable to people even if they're not experiencing intense limerence. Like, that is great advice regardless, especially to just, keep your center in the early stages of courtship, or if you're feeling insecure in general, and projecting on any people. But I know you've got to go. Thank you so much for your time and for your expertise and your knowledge. I'll put the links to your work and the book. People can order it in the show notes. And just really appreciate this chat today.
Thanks so much, Freya. It was really great. Thank you.
Hey, me again. If you'd like to support the potty and you've already given it 5 stars on whatever platform you're listening on, I want to mention that you can buy some really dope merch from the website and get yourself a Labia Lounge tote, tee, togs. Yep, you heard that right. I even have Labia Lounge bathers, or a cute fanny pack if that'd blow your hair back. So if fashion isn't your passion, though, you can donate to my Buy Me a Coffee donation page, which is actually called Buy Me a Soy Chai Latte, because I'll be the first to admit I'm a bit of a Melbourne cafe tosser like that. And yes, that is my coffee order. You can do a once-off donation or an ongoing membership and sponsor me for as little as 3 fat ones a month. And I also offer one-on-one coaching and online courses that'll help you level up your sex life and relationship with yourself and others in a really big way. So every bit helps because it ain't cheap to put out a sweet podcast into the world every week out of my own pocket. So I will be undyingly grateful if you support me and my biz financially in any of these ways. And if you like, I'll even give you a mental BJ with my mind from the lounge itself. Saucy. And I'll pop the links in the show notes. Thank you. Later. And that's it, darling hearts. Thanks for stopping by the Labia Lounge. Your bum groove in the couch will be right where you left it, just waiting for you to sink back in for some more double L action next time. If you'd be a dear and subscribe, share this episode, or leave a review on iTunes, then you can pat yourself on the snatch because that's a downright act of sex-positive feminist activism, and you'd be supporting my vision to educate, empower, demystify, and destigmatize with this here podcast. I'm also always open to feedback, topic ideas that you'd love to hear covered, questions or guest suggestions, so feel free to get in touch via my website or over on Insta. You can also send me in TMI stories to be shared anonymously on the pod. My handle is freyagraph_the Labia Lounge, if my account hasn't been deleted for being too sex positive, which, is always a possibility with censorship. But just in case the chronic censorship finally does obliterate my social channels, I'd highly recommend going and joining my mailing list and snagging yourself some fun freebies for the trouble at www.freyagraph.com/freebies. Anyway, later labial legends. See you next time.